My entitled cousin tried to ruin my life after I refused to babysit. Now she's facing jail time. Hello, read it. My name is Vanessa Reed, and if there's one thing I've learned after 31 years in this family, it's that saying no comes with consequences. I wasn't the youngest, nor was I the eldest, not the most successful or the most troubled. I was simply the reliable one. The one people called when they needed something, when they wanted a favor, when they had a problem they didn't want to deal with themselves. I had spent my entire life bending, adjusting, making space for everyone else's needs while mine were pushed aside as an afterthought. And for years, I let it happen because that's what I had been raised to do. But this time, I had finally drawn a line. This time, I said no. And that's when my world unraveled. It started with a phone call, a simple, seemingly harmless call at an unreasonable hour. My phone buzzed aggressively on my nightstand, yanking me from the shallow, restless sleep I had barely managed to fall into. I groggily reached for it, my half-conscious mind already irritated before I even saw the name on the screen. But when I did, a familiar sense of dread settled in my stomach. Melanie, my cousin, the family's golden child, the one who had been doted on, praised, and excused her entire life while the rest of us had been expected to make sacrifices for her comfort. She was the type of person who took without asking, demanded without gratitude, and never considered the possibility that the world didn't revolve around her. I considered ignoring the call, knowing from experience that whatever she wanted at this hour would be unreasonable. But Melanie didn't give up easily. When I didn't answer, she called again and again. The insistence in her repeated calls made me reluctantly pick up, if only to get it over with. The moment I did, she launched into a frantic, barely coherent monologue about how she needed me to come over immediately to babysit her kids. It took a few seconds for my sleep-addled brain to process what she was saying, but when I did, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Her children weren't babies. They weren't toddlers who needed constant supervision. They were 17 and 15, fully capable of staying home alone for a few hours without disaster striking. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Melanie had decided that I would do this for her, and therefore, I was expected to obey without question. She claimed she had an emergency, though her voice lacked any real urgency. She provided no details, only vague insistence that she had to leave right now, that she had no one else, that I had to come over and watch her almost adult children. The sheer entitlement in her voice made something inside me snap. This was always how it went. Melanie made reckless decisions, and the rest of us had to adjust our lives to accommodate her. My whole life, I had been taught to keep the peace, to say yes, to go along with whatever was asked of me because that's what family does. But for the first time in my life, I said no. At first, I tried to be reasonable, explaining that I had work in the morning, that her kids didn't need a babysitter, that this wasn't my responsibility. But she wasn't interested in logic. She talked over me, dismissing every argument as if I were a stubborn child refusing to follow instructions. When I stayed firm, her tone turned sharp. She accused me of being selfish, ungrateful, a bad family member who couldn't even be bothered to help out when she was in a crisis. I held my ground, but the conversation left me rattled. I knew my refusal wouldn't go unnoticed. In this family, defiance wasn't tolerated. The next morning, the storm began. I woke up to dozens of missed calls, unread messages, and a group chat that had exploded into chaos while I was sleeping. Melanie had wasted no time spinning the story in her favor. According to her, I had abandoned her in a time of desperate need. She claimed she had been forced into a terrible situation, that she had counted on me, that I had betrayed the family by refusing to step up. The details were vague, the accusations heavy, and worst of all, people believed her. I scrolled through the messages in disbelief. My aunt had sent a string of tearful texts, asking how I could do this to Melanie. My uncle had left a furious voicemail, calling me ungrateful after everything the family had done for me. Even distant relatives who never reached out were suddenly involved, sending passive-aggressive messages about how family comes first. No one had even asked for my side of the story. Melanie had spoken first, and that was all that mattered. I tried to defend myself, but it was useless. Every attempt to explain was met with dismissive replies, accusations of making excuses, and guilt-laden remarks about how I had changed, how I had forgotten the importance of family. It didn't matter that her kids were old enough to stay home alone. It didn't matter that she had never actually explained what her so-called emergency was. The only thing that mattered was that I had said no to her, and that was unacceptable. By the end of the day, I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and furious in a way I had never been before. I had spent my entire life bending to accommodate others, sacrificing my own needs to keep the peace. But this was different. This wasn't just family drama. This was an attack. And I had the sinking feeling that Melanie wasn't done yet. That night, as I tried to settle into what I hoped would be a quiet evening, the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me from my thoughts, sending a cold wave of unease through my body. It was late, too late for visitors. My first thought was that it was one of my relatives coming to scold me in person. But as I approached the door and looked through the peephole, my stomach dropped. Standing on my porch weren't family members. They weren't even people I knew. They were police officers. And in that moment, I knew that whatever Melanie had done, whatever story she had told, this had gone far beyond family drama. And it was only just beginning. I stood frozen at the door, staring through the peephole at the two uniformed officers waiting on my porch. My mind raced through every possibility, but nothing made sense. I hadn't done anything. I wasn't involved in anything illegal. There was no reason for the police to be here, unless Melanie had made sure there was. Taking a deep breath, I forced my hands to stay steady as I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The warm night air felt heavy, thick with something unspoken, something wrong. The officers looked at me with that polite but firm expression I'd seen a few times before, detached, professional, unreadable. One of them, a tall man with graying hair, asked me to confirm my name. When I did, he wasted no time informing me that they had received a report concerning my neglect of minors. The words hit like a physical blow. Neglect. Minors. I felt my breath catch, my stomach twist. I barely managed to keep my voice level as I asked what they were talking about. The officer, reading from his notes, told me that someone, he didn't say who, but I already knew, had reported that I had refused to provide care for two underage children left in a dangerous situation. The claim was that I had knowingly abandoned them, that I had put them at risk, that my actions had caused undue distress to the children involved. For a moment, I couldn't even respond. The sheer audacity of it, the level of manipulation it took to twist reality so completely. My head spun with disbelief, with rage, with the impossible absurdity of what was happening. The report made it sound as if I had walked out on two helpless kids in a life-threatening emergency. But Melanie's kids were nearly adults. They weren't helpless. There had been no danger. This entire thing was a lie. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm as I explained the truth. I told them that Melanie had called me at midnight, that she had demanded I babysit, that I had refused because her kids didn't need a babysitter in the first place. I made sure to emphasize their ages, their independence, the fact that they had been perfectly safe in their own home. The younger officer, a woman with sharp eyes, nodded slightly as I spoke, as if she was already starting to piece together that something wasn't adding up. But the other officer, the older one, remained unreadable. He simply listened, flipping through his notepad, and when I finished speaking, he told me that, unfortunately, they had to investigate all claims of child endangerment. I wanted to scream. This wasn't just an inconvenience. This was serious. Melanie had escalated things to a level that went beyond family drama. She had turned it into something that could actually affect my record, my job, my entire life. And for what? Because I told her no? Because she couldn't stand the idea of someone denying her what she wanted? They asked me a few more questions, where I had been that night, whether I had any witnesses who could confirm my side of the story. I struggled with that. I lived alone. I hadn't spoken to anyone after Melanie's call. I had no way to prove that I hadn't simply abandoned her kids. No security footage showing me minding my own business in my apartment while she crafted this ridiculous accusation. The officers eventually left, but not before letting me know that a social services caseworker might follow up. The words felt surreal coming out of their mouths. A caseworker, as if I was some negligent guardian, as if I was someone who actually needed to be investigated. I barely managed to close the door behind me before the shaking started. I sat on the couch, my mind spinning through the past 24 hours, trying to make sense of how everything had escalated this far. Just yesterday, my biggest problem had been a few angry text messages from relatives. Now, I had a potential legal issue looming over me because Melanie had spun reality into a complete fabrication. And the worst part? I knew she wasn't done. Sure enough, by morning, my name was everywhere. The family group chat had exploded into new levels of chaos. My aunt had written an emotional post on Facebook about how some people forget where they came from, how family should always come first, and how tragic it is when selfishness puts children at risk. She didn't name me, but the implication was clear. The comments section was filled with relatives expressing their outrage, their disappointment, their thinly veiled disgust at whoever could be so heartless. My phone was buzzing with calls, messages, voicemails, all of them demanding answers, demanding apologies, demanding I fix what I had done. There was no fixing this. I tried to respond at first, tried to push back against the narrative that was rapidly being cemented as the truth. But every attempt was met with hostility. No one wanted to listen. They had already chosen a side. The golden cousin had spoken, and the rest of the family fell in line behind her, as they always did. By the afternoon, the first email came in from my employer's HR department. Someone, Melanie, had contacted them anonymously, claiming that I was under investigation for child endangerment and that my position at work should be reconsidered. I sat frozen at my desk, staring at the email, feeling a sinking sense of horror settle over me. This wasn't just about family anymore. She was trying to destroy me. I knew then that there was only one way out of this. Melanie had expected me to roll over, to take the blame, to beg for forgiveness, just to make the problem go away. But I wasn't going to do that. Not this time. This time I was fighting back. By the time a caseworker showed up at my door 3 days later, I had already spoken to a lawyer. I had already documented everything. The texts, the calls, the voicemail from my uncle, even the online posts my relatives had made. I handed everything over, including proof that Melanie's kids were old enough to be left alone, that there had been no emergency, that she had fabricated the entire thing out of spite. The caseworker listened, took notes, nodded in understanding. By the time they left, I could tell that the truth was finally starting to crack through the lies. But Melanie wasn't going to let it go that easily. 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of loud banging on my door. It wasn't the police this time. It was Melanie. She was screaming my name, shouting through the door, her voice slurred with rage. I could barely make out the words, but what I did hear sent a chill through me. She was threatening me, cursing at me, telling me I had ruined her life, that she would make sure I paid for it. I stayed frozen, heart hammering, listening to her meltdown on my doorstep. And then, she did something even I hadn't expected. She tried to break in. That was the final straw. I didn't even hesitate. I called the police, told them everything, and when they arrived, I let them handle it. This time, they weren't just taking notes. This time, they were taking action. By morning, I had filed a restraining order. Melanie had tried to ruin my life over something as petty as a refused favor, and in the process, she had destroyed her own. And I had never felt so relieved. Filing the restraining order should have been the end of it. In my mind, I had done everything right. I had gathered proof, defended myself, and put legal protection in place to keep Melanie away. But if there was one thing I had learned about my cousin over the years, it was that she never accepted losing. She didn't just lash out when things didn't go her way. She escalated. I had thought I had seen the worst of her manipulations. I had thought the false report, the family turning against me, and her attempt to destroy my job were the most damage she could do. I was wrong. The night after she was removed from my doorstep by the police, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, half expecting another disturbance. My entire body was on edge, waiting for the next attack. The restraining order was filed, but I knew that a piece of paper wouldn't stop someone like Melanie. She wasn't the kind of person who backed down when she felt wronged, especially when she had been humiliated. And for Melanie, this was beyond personal now. By morning, my suspicions were confirmed. My phone lit up with a new flood of messages, not from family this time, but from coworkers. Someone had sent an anonymous email to multiple people in my office, including my boss, attaching the police report from the welfare check at my home. The email claimed I had a history of neglecting children, that I had been investigated for child endangerment, that I was a risk to the company's reputation. I felt sick. I immediately contacted my lawyer, who assured me that this was a transparent attempt at defamation. The case had already been dismissed. The police had already determined that no actual crime had taken place. But that didn't matter. The damage was already done. My boss had called me in for a meeting. My coworkers were whispering behind my back. The words child neglect lingered in their minds, even if the accusation was false. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Melanie wasn't satisfied with trying to ruin my personal life. Now, she wanted to destroy my career. She wanted to break me so completely that I had no choice but to crawl back, to beg for the family's forgiveness, to let her win. But she had underestimated me. I had spent my whole life being the quiet one, the accommodating one, the person who kept the peace at my own expense. But I wasn't that person anymore. She had already taken enough from me. My peace of mind, my reputation, my sense of safety. She wasn't going to take my future. I took action. The first step was forwarding the email to HR, along with my lawyer's official response that this was harassment and defamation. I made it clear that this was an ongoing legal issue, that any attempt to use Melanie's false allegations against me could result in a lawsuit. The legal department at my company took it seriously, and by the end of the day, my boss reassured me that my job was safe. But that wasn't enough. I wanted proof. I wanted to catch her in the act. With my lawyer's guidance, I filed another complaint against Melanie for harassment, attaching every single thing she had done. Her false police report, her attempts to ruin my reputation, her drunken tantrum at my doorstep, and now this. But that still wasn't enough. I knew that as long as she thought she could get away with it, she would keep coming. So I set a trap. Melanie was predictable. She thrived on attention, on knowing she had gotten under my skin. So I did the one thing she couldn't resist. I baited her. I made a post on social media. Nothing directly calling her out, just a vague but pointed message about how some people will go to insane lengths to control others when they don't get their way. I knew she would see it. I knew she wouldn't be able to help herself. And I was right. That night, I got the call I was waiting for. A restricted number. A familiar voice, slurred with anger, demanding to know if I thought I was better than her, if I really believed I could ruin her life without consequences. I let her rant, let her incriminate herself, let her spill every bit of venom she had been holding in. And I recorded every second of it. By the time the call ended, I had everything I needed. I had proof of her harassment, her threats, her obsession with making me suffer. The next morning, I handed it all over to my lawyer and filed for an official criminal harassment charge. This time, she wasn't just facing a piece of paper telling her to stay away. This time, she was facing real legal consequences. The silence from her was immediate. No more emails, no more police reports, no more late-night calls. I didn't know if she had been arrested yet, but I knew she was finally feeling the weight of everything she had done. And then, a week later, I got the message that made it all worth it. A short, clipped text from my aunt. The same woman who had berated me, who had called me selfish, who had painted me as the villain in my own family. The same woman who had blindly defended her daughter through everything. She wanted to talk. Suddenly, the tide was turning, and I knew that Melanie's house of lies was finally starting to collapse. When I saw my aunt's message, I didn't respond right away. After everything that had happened, I knew better than to expect anything resembling an apology or accountability. If she was reaching out, it wasn't because she wanted to make amends, it was because she needed something. That was how it always worked. My family had spent years treating me as a resource, a problem solver, a convenient dumping ground for their emotional baggage. They only came to me when there was something to clean up, something to absorb. I stared at my phone, debating whether to ignore her completely. But the wording of her message stuck with me. It wasn't the usual guilt-tripping, the condescending disappointment, the manipulative language meant to wear me down. It was brief, almost hesitant. She wanted to meet. She said it was urgent. That alone made me wary. Melanie had been silent for a full week. No calls, no messages, no new attempts to spread lies about me. I had assumed that my legal action had finally put an end to her attacks, that she had retreated into whatever miserable pit she had dug for herself. But if my aunt was reaching out now, something had changed. And whatever it was, I needed to know. I agreed to meet, but I wasn't about to walk into another trap. I chose a public cafe in the middle of town, somewhere neutral, somewhere with plenty of people around. If this was another attempt to corner me into submission, I wanted witnesses. When I arrived, my aunt was already there, sitting at a small table near the window. She looked different, tired, drained, almost defeated. It was the first time I had ever seen her look small. This was a woman who had spent her entire life defending Melanie's behavior, propping her up, making excuses for her. Seeing her like this made my stomach twist with unease. The moment I sat down, she got straight to the point. Melanie was in trouble. Real trouble. At first, I expected another dramatic exaggeration, another attempt to paint Melanie as the victim of some cruel injustice. But as my aunt spoke, I realized this wasn't just family drama anymore. This wasn't another fabricated story to guilt me into submission. Melanie's life was actually falling apart. After I filed for the restraining order and pressed charges for harassment, Melanie had gone into a downward spiral. She had been fired from her job after one of her coworkers came forward with a complaint. Apparently, she had been making their life miserable for months, and when my legal issues surfaced, HR had taken the opportunity to remove her. She had maxed out her credit cards, hiring a lawyer to fight the charges, but it hadn't worked. The evidence I had provided, the recorded phone call, the text messages, the proof of her relentless harassment had been airtight. And now, she was looking at actual legal consequences. The court had issued a formal order against her. If she so much as contacted me again, if she tried anything, she could be arrested. Her fabricated police report had been flagged as malicious intent, and a judge wasn't sympathetic. She wasn't just facing fines, she was facing possible jail time. My aunt's voice cracked as she told me all of this, as if expecting me to feel sorry for her daughter, as if waiting for me to finally say, "Okay, I'll fix this for you." But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, listening, feeling an eerie sense of detachment. This was what Melanie had always done. She had wreaked havoc, torched everything in her path, and expected someone else to deal with the consequences. But this time, there was no one left to clean up her mess. And that was why my aunt was here. She wanted me to drop the charges, to let it go, to be the bigger person because Melanie was going through so much. She pleaded with me, telling me that Melanie wasn't herself lately, that she was struggling, that she had made mistakes, that she didn't deserve to have her life ruined over something that had gotten out of hand. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Melanie didn't deserve to have her life ruined? What about everything she had done to me? What about the lies, the defamation, the smear campaign she had orchestrated to try to destroy my job, my reputation, my very existence? What about the moment I opened my door to find the police standing there because of her malicious accusations? Had that gotten out of hand too? I took a deep breath, letting my aunt finish her desperate plea before I leaned forward, keeping my voice calm, steady, unshaken. And then I told her no. Afinal no. No explanations. No apologies. No hesitation. I told her that I wasn't going to fix this for Melanie, that every consequence she was facing was a direct result of her own choices, that she had built this house of lies and manipulation, and now she was finally being forced to live in it. My aunt's face crumbled. She tried to argue, tried to use the same tired guilt tactics, the same, but she's family reasoning that had been used against me my entire life. But I shut it down. I told her that family had never protected me, that not once, not when Melanie dragged my name through the dirt, not when she tried to ruin my career, not when she showed up screaming at my doorstep, had a single one of them stood up for me. And now I was done. I stood up, placed a few bills on the table for my coffee, and walked away. I didn't turn back. I didn't care to see her reaction. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one carrying the weight of their problems anymore. By the time I got home, my phone was already buzzing. My aunt had clearly reported back to the rest of the family, because now the floodgates had opened. Angry texts poured in, some from cousins, some from uncles and aunts I barely spoke to. Some called me cruel, others accused me of turning my back on my own blood. But I didn't respond. I had spent too many years drowning in this family's dysfunction, and I was finally free of it. The next morning, my lawyer called me with the final update. Melanie had officially been charged with harassment. Because of her repeated offenses and her documented history of false reports, she wasn't just facing a fine. She was facing a real possibility of jail time. The silence from her was immediate. No more messages. No more rumors. No more calls. For the first time in my life, Melanie had been stopped. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The silence in the days that followed was eerie. No more messages. No more accusations. No more desperate attempt from my family to pressure me into submission. It felt like I had walked away from a war zone, leaving behind the wreckage of something I had spent my entire life trapped inside. But I knew better than to believe it was truly over. Melanie wasn't the type to accept defeat. Even with the legal system closing in, even with everything she had done blowing up in her face, I knew she was still out there, waiting for her next move. I tried to settle back into my life, but there was always this lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. I kept expecting another attack, another phone call, another escalation. But none came. The legal case was moving forward. My lawyer was handling everything, and as far as I knew, Melanie had no more options left. And then, 2 weeks later, I got the call that changed everything. It wasn't from my aunt or my lawyer or any of my family members. It was from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a calm, professional voice introduced herself as a private investigator. I almost hung up, assuming it was some kind of scam, but then she said something that made my blood run cold. She had been hired to look into me. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing. Someone had paid a private investigator to dig into my life. My immediate thought was Melanie. This had her fingerprints all over it. But before I could even ask, the woman on the other end of the call told me that she wasn't working for Melanie. She had been hired by someone else. My uncle. I sank onto the couch, barely able to process what I was hearing. My uncle, the same man who had left me a scathing voicemail calling me ungrateful, the same man who had defended Melanie at every turn, had quietly hired a private investigator to look into the real story. And what she found was worse than I could have imagined. Melanie had been hiding more than just her attempts to ruin my life. The investigator had uncovered a trail of financial fraud, evidence of identity theft, and even forged legal documents in Melanie's name. My uncle had suspected something was off when she came to him begging for money to cover her legal fees. When he asked for proof of where the money was going, she had gotten cagey, defensive, dodging his questions. That's when he decided to look deeper. And what he found shook him to his core. For years, Melanie had been stealing, not just from me, but from everyone. She had been using family members' names to open credit cards, siphoning money under fake emergencies, even forging my aunt's signature on loans. She had built a financial empire out of deception, and now it was all starting to collapse. I sat in stunned silence as the investigator laid it all out. My uncle, in his arrogance, had assumed I had been the problem. He had believed every word Melanie said, until he started losing money himself, until he realized that his precious daughter wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. And now he was panicking. The investigator told me that my uncle wanted to meet, that he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. But I knew better. This wasn't about making things right. This was about damage control. He wanted to get ahead of the scandal before it blew up in his face. For the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. I told the investigator to relay a message back to him. I owe you nothing. I didn't agree to a meeting. I didn't let him try to justify years of enabling Melanie. He had spent decades defending her, covering for her, refusing to see the truth. And now, he was getting exactly what he deserved. The fallout was brutal. Within a week, Melanie was arrested again. This time, it wasn't for harassment. This time, It was for fraud, for identity theft, for charges that carried real weight. The family was in shambles. My aunt, once Melanie's fiercest protector, went silent. My uncle, desperate to salvage his reputation, tried to spin the story in his favor, but no one was buying it. And me? For the first time, I was completely free. The restraining order remained in place. Melanie was no longer a looming threat in my life. The family, once so quick to turn against me, was now drowning in its own dysfunction. I was on the outside, watching it all fall apart, untouched. I had spent years being the fixer, the peacemaker, the one who took the hits so that everyone else could remain comfortable. But I had walked away. I had chosen myself. And because of that, I had survived. Melanie had spent her life believing that she was untouchable, that she could manipulate her way out of anything. But she had finally learned the hard way that actions have consequences. And this time, there was no one left to save her.